Thank you for having us up here. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the invite, and it's an honor to be up here, and it's something that this program is fairly new. It's only been about 2.5 years old now. My name is Chad Marsee. I'm the project coordinator for the Native Nations Climate Adaptation Program. I'm a member of the Colville Confederated Tribes, which as of last week, I believe we changed our name officially. Now we're the 12 Confederated Tribes of the Big Water Nation. And so that's passed by resolution by council last week. And so that'll be getting some use to, I guess. Like I mentioned, this program was originally started by, which the logo down is in the right-hand corner, Center for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions. My boss is still my boss. The director is Kathy Jacobs. And at that time, they wrote a grant to the Howry Foundation, or Howry program. Howry provided us 3 years of funding to start this program from scratch. So when they hired me in January 15, this program started from scratch. And so it was all much of a learning process, I think. And I come from my background primarily has been in criminal prosecution. And so I spent most of my time in the county attorney's office as a criminal prosecutor of my tribe before that. And I spent some time with DEA before that too. A lot of this though is that I was also, not speaking to an alumni group, I was also president of U of A Native American alumni for 10 years. A lot of my contacts have been with tribes through the fundraising mechanism. And so building this program, a lot of this is being the broker between university research, which these guys do a lot of, and policymakers at tribes. And so and I preach this a lot of times when I do this speech, is that we can do all the research we want, unless somebody reads it and applies that information, there's nothing really comes out of it. So my job is really to match up the councils we're working with the information that's coming out. So, next slide. I know I missed that slide, but something I always want to brag about too, because I know this program's new, and you've seen all the faces that were up there, but I always brag, guys, but I think we're now the largest Native American program on campus, as far as staff. I mean, that's not a lot of student staff too. Native Nations Climate Adaptation Program, real quick, I know I have 4 minutes, but our vision was when we started this thing was supporting Native Americans and their communities as they meet climate challenges. Our mission was to build capacity and to work collaboratively with Native American tribes and indigenous populations throughout the US and Mexico. What we identified our kind of boundaries when we first started this thing was Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and California, which is 194 tribes represented in that region alone. And I'll get through some of the stuff, how that's changed, and going forward, because really we're not really limited to those borders. We do work with tribes all over the country now. Next slide. So when I first started here, like I mentioned before, I didn't come with a huge environmental background. And so one of my first things was trying to learn what was actually out there, what was going on in the United States right now, and with tribes. So I did a bunch of research, and we figured that right now, as we know it, and I compared this with federal numbers with BIA and DOI, Forest Service, trying to figure out what tribes actually have climate adaptation plans. And the way I drew the line was adopted by their council. And what we could figure out, there's 11, and this is back in 2015. Since that time, there's been, I want to say 3 or 4 that's been adopted since, that's come on board. And so when we helped, we actually got some funds from the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and we hosted a conference here in 15. That's what the report that came out of this was. We brought those 11 tribes in, ranged from, don't quote me on all these, is that we had Shinnecock from Long Island, Mohawk, Salish Kootenai, Swinomish, James.
Next slide.
Yeah, it's all next slide. So I'll go through those. So it's, Scott knows more about my PowerPoint than I do. So we brought all those tribes in. You can go to the next slide now, I guess. So we brought all those tribes in, and basically the outcome was trying to learn best practices amongst all those 11 tribes and trying to figure out really how they got from point A to B, from how they got the funding to what they're doing with it now, whether it's shelved or not, or whether they're actually doing implementation. And so, half of them admitted they wrote the report and shelved it. The other half are trying to get funds to actually do implementation yet. And so a lot of that was going through the process so we could share that with other tribes around the country. And of course, most of the tribes we talk to, I don't want to get too far in my 4 minutes, most of the tribes we talk to are not asking when we go to a tribe, say, what is that city doing or what is that county doing? They're asking what other tribes are doing nationwide. And so we're trying to gather that information and share that with them going forward. Next slide. And so this was our latest report that came out, and this came out actually a few months ago. DOI helped fund this project, but out of the 194 tribes I mentioned, and I give credit to Northern Arizona University as well, they did something similar to this in 2010, roughly. They actually did a lot of it was online research, and they're trying to figure out what tribes got grants, and we're doing climate activities with those grants. For us, what we did was kind of differently is that we didn't do anything really internet-based. We contacted every single tribe by telephone. We actually tried to do in-person or over the phone interviews with them. So out of that, roughly 26 tribes took our survey. A lot of that was, we had nine questions, I think it was 9. And we went through and basically asking questions about where they're at now, what their level of expertise was, who they're partnering with, what they're looking forward at, whether that be mitigation or adaptation. So what kind of activity they're looking at in the future. Right now, we hired, and my last point I think on this one was we hired Dr. Valerie Small, who's from the Crow Indian Reservation, in January. And so all the information that's coming out of there, now she's the research arm of this. And so she's gonna be doing a lot of the on-the-ground research with tribes coming out of this report. So, next slide. So I know I went over 4, I think, so I'm gonna cut in Skylar's time, so I'll give it to him next.
Chwan askenahe giathis Skylar Chu, agisisithith guarine, ginika haka swake, waknanas garuda equahera gaidakbe. Yawa hat ton autumn, gawa yiguat eruchwe ha yiguat nana, yawa. Hakanaherase. Hello, I hope you have peace. My name is Skylar Chu. I'm Mohawk Wolf Clan from 6 Nations of the Grand River that's up in southern Ontario. And I grew up on the Tuscarora Nation, which is just outside of Niagara Falls, New York. I'd like to acknowledge the Tonawattam Nation. We are here on their traditional homelands, and we're grateful to be gathered here on their lands. And I give you all greetings. I am a graduate assistant with the Native Nations Climate Adaptation Program, and I'm also a PhD student in the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Arizona. So I'm going to give you a little overview of the research that I do, which is with the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. So we're going to leave the Southwest and we're going to go up to the Great Basin in Nevada. So you can, next slide. So the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe is deeply connected to their lands and their landscape. The place that they call home, Pyramid Lake, is their place where they were created, where their oral history tells that they were created. So as they work to protect this land, it's very personal for their work. And I got involved in this research through my advisor who had been working with this tribe for several years before I joined the project a few years ago. I can click. So Pyramid Lake was formed during the last ice age when the area known as the Great Basin actually had a different climate. It was much wetter. It was not as much evaporation. So the low-lying lands of the Great Basin, if you've been there, they were hundreds of feet higher with water. Well, as we left that ice age and we're in the current climate change of our current geologic period, that all dried up and it left these remnant lakes. You can click once again, and it left the Pyramid Lake, which you can see up to the upper portion. Pyramid Lake is located within the basin, the Truckee River Basin, which gets all its water from the Sierra Nevadas. You can, next slide. So as you can see, the lake is really closely connected to the people, their landscape. Click once. The kiwi fish, the people there call themselves kiwi eaters. So this fish is really closely connected to their identity. So protecting this fish is paramount. And click once more. We'll have the Lahontan cutthroat trout, which is also important to the tribe. The tribe manages a very robust fishery. And over the past 100 years, with water being diverted from this basin for agriculture, the bottom species went extinct. The Pyramid Lake strain went extinct. And the tribe in the past 60 years has made tremendous efforts to introduce a similar strain into the lake and develop fisheries to bring back this fish so it can thrive again. Next slide. So as you can see here, these are largely non-native fishermen that come out to Pyramid Lake and try to catch the largest Lahontan. So the tribe manages a very robust fishery, which is important for their economic development. So the tribe has come a long way, and the tribe has been adaptive to a lot of changes in their basin. So what's really important now is understanding how they're going to protect this landscape, this lake, and these fish into the future. So if we click once, you'll see that we did a survey with tribal members. You can click 2 more times. As you can see, it's highly evident that tribal members are aware that climate change is happening, that they've observed changes, and that they really want action for climate change at the national level. We can go to the next slide. So just to kind of wrap up some of the key findings of this work with the tribe, Pyramid Lake is highly resilient, and they're a leader in adaptation, not only for other tribes, but within the Great Basin. This picture here is the fish elevator that the tribe had put in the 70s that allows fish to come upstream and also protects this landscape. So if you click, we'll have a few of the key findings. So, tribal members' concern for their environment is really key for helping this community reduce their vulnerability. Click again. Understanding how those fish is really important and is something that we're looking at so that the tribe can understand what's necessary. And then understanding how the lake is connected to climate factors is also critical for allowing this tribe to move forward in the future. So the next slide is just my conclusions. You can just click through a bunch of people. I'd like to acknowledge the tribe that we've been collaborating with, the research funding for this project, and my collaborators, my advisor, and some other researchers. Now I thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, I'm Lydia Jennings. I'm from the Tuscarora Nation on my father's side and the Ecological Nation on my mother's side. And I'm going to talk to you about my research today. My research is a little bit different. I actually work with active mining sites here in Arizona. And also within that context of looking at how mining, which is a very common industry on Native communities, how we can integrate the indigenous perspective of land use and land management into this reclamation process. So again, the need for indigenous perspectives in the mine tailing reclamation process. Next slide, please. Oh, and I should just say I'm from the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Sciences, the same department as Skylar. So in Arizona, you've probably seen our flag here. We're one of the largest one of our largest industries is copper in the state of Arizona. And extraction is an important part of our industry, of our state economy. But when you look at where mining happens, it's typically on or bordering indigenous communities. And when you look at internationally, this is also a pattern that happens, that extraction industries happen on or bordering indigenous communities. About half of the global mines are on Native communities. So it's really important to understand, one, what is the reclamation process as indigenous people, but two, how can our values of land be integrated into that process. So part of what my research is doing is really working with mining companies to improve their reclamation strategies to make it more cost efficient and effective, but also to have an indigenous perspective in that reclamation process. So next slide, please. So the main site that I work on is actually working with the Tohono Nation. This is just south of us in Sahuarita area. And there's 2 parcels of land in that area. The upper portion, I thought I had a pointer, sorry, but on the upper square up there is on Tohono Nation land. And then this southernmost point square area by the 19 sign is on private mining land. And so because they have 2 different views of land management and strategies, and the upper portion is leased from Tohono Nation, they've had very different strategies to go about the mining reclamation process. And so I think it's a nice overview to talk about today of having these 2 different land management strategies and how that's changed the reclamation process and also the overall quality of the reclamation, and also the importance of integrating traditional ecological knowledge into that process. And I just want to point out that upper corner is a picture of me with our tribal liaison who goes out and field samples with us. And it's really important that we have these tribal monitors there with us to ensure that we are treating the land in the manner that is respectable, and who really have this important basis of knowledge about the areas that we're sampling in. So next slide, please. So this is the area that's on the Tohono Nation land. And so, let's actually go back one. And so what I really want to highlight with this part is that the mining company in the reclamation EIS report, the mining company gave the tribe a budget of about $25 million. It might seem like a lot, but comparatively, other sites within this area are $480 million. So it's a relatively cheap reclamation price. And then from this, the tribe went and worked with the Bureau of Land Management and also with their own environmental quality department. And from that, they took a bit of a risk in the mining company's perspective and in the BLM's perspective. The tribe decided to implement putting a 12-inch, almost a foot-inch of soil on top of that mine tailings, and that's the waste product of the extraction process. That often has very high in chemical content and heavy metals, and is very finely ground up. And so if that mine tailings gets into the local dust transport system, it can really impact the quality of air as well as soil and water. So it's important that we stabilize that waste product. So the tribal community decided to put 12 inches of soil, but they also picked what specific plant species were used. All local plants that have done really well, and again, having this traditional ecological knowledge as part of that, the basis for picking these specific plants. Now, next slide, please. The mining company decided to see if they can do something very similar to this, but for a cheaper price. So they went ahead and only used 6 inches of topsoil. And you see that there's a very different plant composition and coverage composition that's happening at these two sites. So again, because I only have 4 minutes, I just wanted to really highlight that the difference in quality when we have traditional ecological knowledge integrated into these reclamation processes. Next slide, please. Now, as an Indigenous scholar, I am always trying to indigenize science. But what I really noticed with using this work is that when we talk about the reclamation strategies, who are the stakeholders at the table? Academia is present, the mining companies are present, and we assume that they're working with the Native communities that they are leasing this land from. But why aren't the Native communities more present in this conversation? We also have regulatory agencies who work with tribes to some capacity, but really, tribes should be at the table just as much as these three other stakeholders. So that's the next boxes, which is going to put. And so again, if we want to have effective reclamation, we want to be talking to the communities who have been living here sustainably on these lands for generations. Because Indigenous people have always been sustainable. So next slide. And so just the last point, or I just want to talk a little bit about the different viewpoints of Indigenous people versus Western land managers. Indigenous people, us viewing our land as alive and having rights, that the need for land to be pristine and having a spiritual purpose, as well as Indigenous land keepers thinking 7 generations forward, not just through the lifespan of a mine. And mining sites can typically run between 30 to 100 years, but we need to be thinking much further than that. And so my last slide, this is kind of just talking about the global, if you want next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I guess I should have left that out, never mind. But in just closing, sorry about that. With climate change happening, with the increased demands for technologies, every time there's a new cell phone, I think about it, the demand for metals and resource extraction is going to increase. And here in the Southwest, we particularly feel that demand. It's happening right here in our backyard. But if we're going to continue to have these types of technologies and this kind of economic development, we need to make sure that Indigenous people are involved in that process because we're the ones who are most at risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reminding me that we had these PowerPoint presentations for the questions. So I will repeat the first question again. Thank you for your presentations. They were very informative, by the way. Really helpful for giving us some context for now answering these questions. So again, question number 1, what are some of the most significant social and environmental issues the communities you work with face? You've discussed that some, but I think you can go into more depth. Is there overlap with the social challenges and environmental challenges? So in other words, do they combine? Sorry, I'm trying to bring this to you guys.
Yeah, so I'll start with that. So I think that mining is one in particular that is a lot of reported and published, and we see here personally, examples of where the environmental impacts and social impacts really overlap. Environmentally, mining is a very violent process. You are digging into the land, and as a soil ecologist, I understand those complex relationships with the soil, the water, the plants all interrelate to create a healthy ecosystem. But when you are mining, you're impacting the air, you're impacting the water, you're impacting the soil quality. But those are also impacting traditional livelihoods. It impacts a community's ability to have traditional farming practices, which then translates to the health of the community. A great example of that is Laguna Pueblo, and them having mining, a uranium mine coming to their community, and that impacting their ability to have traditional foods, which then impacts their ability to have traditional medicines. And so what ended up happening is community members would get Western medicine and Western foods and really responding really negatively to a lot of those traditional medicines. And that very much happens here locally as well. Additionally, and socially, you're losing that loss of traditional hunting grounds, which impacts, again, communities' health. You're having a huge influx of outsiders coming to a community, because typically with mining, it's an influx of young men, typically white men, who don't always understand the community dynamics and social structures. And we see in cases up in North Dakota and here locally as well, but particularly North Dakota, having a huge influx of young men coming in there, increasing the amount of drug and alcohol consumption that's happening in the community, and really bringing these negative habits into the community. But also that impacts violence against women. I think it's a well-reported statistic that 1 in 3 Native women are susceptible to sexual assault, and that increases exponentially in a lot of these extraction communities. And I don't know how well you are here about the Violence Against Women Act and how that's impacted our ability to charge people on reservation lands, but for the most part, there's this legal loophole of not being able to charge non-Indigenous people when they commit these types of assaults on Native women in our communities. Pasco Yaqui is one of the tribes that has a trial period on that, but that's another factor that's impacting the health, the overall social health of our community long-term, and that has generational effects. The other thing that I think is really important to talk about is that, again, the timeline of a mining site coming into a community. Typically, mines are operating between 50 to 100 years of operation. So what happens when you bring all these people into a community and they start to establish a life there, and then that mine closes down? And now there's several generations of people who don't have employment anymore. And these can be mitigated if a community plans properly, but in the past it hasn't always been that case. So those, I think, are a couple of the overlaps that really happen when we have these extraction industries in our communities.
Thank you, Lydia, that's really important to recognize that a lot of these environmental and social issues in the communities are externally driven. So a key area that is of concern for all tribes, and especially the Pyramid Lake Pai tribe, is water. So this need for water, the vision for settler colonization in the early 1900s was that these dry arid lands were unproductive because they were useless, because no water was going to use. And so there was this vision that the West was going to turn green. So that's the dam that was built just upstream from the Pyramid Lake Pai tribe, Derby Dam, was the first Bureau of Reclamation dam. And the project that it attempted to achieve never came to fruition. It never irrigated the amount of water, but 1905 the dam was built. By 1940s, the Lahontan strain of Pyramid Lake went extinct. So these ecosystems are very fragile, and water is important, and not just for drinking or for industry, but for Indigenous communities, water is life. That's everything that is embedded within Indigenous knowledge. And so understanding that is key, that as tribes are working to protect their waters, it's really not just the superficial stream of water running through the land. They want to maintain enough water. It's connected to the people, it's connected to their identities, connected to the fish and other species. So recognizing that, and those are environmental as well as social issues. There's really no distinct separation there. They largely overlap. So I believe our fourth panelist is here.
Yeah, sorry about that. My name's Fred Stevens. I'm with the Untitled Nation's Wildlife and Vegetation Management Program. So I barely made it in, although everything was closed.
So that's going to quickly add my 2 cents to this. So I'm going to take a completely different direction. Both my background's been in policy and security issues. So the policy side of this is something I preached to like my employers when I first started with this, is that the capacity issue with tribes. So how much do we have employers and employees out there working with tribes to get this job done? And of course, do they have the education to go out and do this work? Something that on campus or U of A, I know a lot of this because I was a alumni president for a long time, is that Native American graduation rate alone for undergrad. Any guesses? I guess you guys want to get audience in there involved. Any guesses what our graduation rate is? 4 years.
42%.
Huh?
42%?
Any others?
27.
22 this year. It's dropped down 5% in the last 4 years. So it's decreased. And so it's something that out of that 22%, how many are actually STEM-related fields? My guess about 5. So it's something that for me to do this job, for everybody else up here, I think we have to be able to educate, graduate, and get people back to their tribe, working there, and doing some of the environmental stuff we're talking about. And so it's something that it's near and dear to my heart, is that education is going to be a primary concern, I think, moving this forward. And we can't be successful with a 22% graduation rate. And that's, I'm not picking on you, because I'm a double alum from there. And this happens all over the country. And so until we put the financing behind it, it's going to be difficult, I think, to move the pin forward. Security, I mentioned, I gave an interview for this thing. Security side of this, a lot of people think of climate change almost 30, 40 years down the road. Well, there are tribes voting right now to relocate the reservation, Alaska, Louisiana. And so this is a long-term project we're worried about. It is a security issue right now for the United States to deal with. And some federal agencies are going to have to step up and be the one responsible for these relocation matters. And so it's a different spin, but it is 2 issues I think that are highly going to be important in the next few years.
Okay, next question. What are your strategies for gathering? Can you hear me okay?
No.
No.
Yeah.
Thank you. What are your strategies for gathering different stakeholders together to help everyone better understand those issues they face?
So the stakeholder involvement thing is primarily pretty much my entire job, is to bring everybody together and work on all these issues. So I always get the story, it was interesting. 3 months after I started this job, there's another department on campus that got a $5 million grant to work in tribal climate change. I didn't know anything about it, we didn't know anything about it. And so that was one of the things where we deal with it in stovepipes. It happens all over the place within government. And so that was one of the very first initiatives we tried to start on campus, was we called it an Indigenous Collaborative Network. And the whole point of that was to bring people together on campus who are Native American or who do Native American research. And basically it was just to gather information and share information on campus. And that could be adopted anywhere, in any university or any entity around the country. So that was internal. We had to get our house in kind of order. Externally, which I always give credit where credit's due, Northern Arizona University used to start a program, or had a program, it's called the Southwest Tribal Climate Change Network. That program ended in 14, and I asked permission to take it over. And so basically we host a once-a-month phone call that drives communication amongst tribes in the Southwest with federal agencies and state agencies. So the whole point of this is basically communication driver. I model a lot of what we do, and if you look at the map that I showed earlier, a lot of the tribal climate change work that's happening is Pacific Northwest based. Of course, you can draw that back to salmon issues, water issues, stuff like that. But I think a lot of it points back to is University of Oregon's involvement. University of Oregon also has a tribal climate change network or program, and they've been hosting that once-a-month phone call for nearly, I think, almost a decade now. They got 90 people a month calling to that thing and sharing information. I think that's what we got to get to, is that, the information's out there, the research is out there. It's really how can we bring everybody together. So it's utilizing strategies like that, I think, and really, I also come from government and at the county and state level, is that it's trying to cut down on duplication of services too. I'm not going to go out and reinvent the wheel. If someone is already doing it, I want to be able to partner with them and collaborate with them and go out and build a better wheel, I guess. And it's something that, I don't know if we've always done in the past. I think we've, gotten grant money and want to run out and create a program. Well, there's already another program going on. And so I think it's that collaboration effort that needs to happen that we're really pushing, at least in this program. So
I think for my area of research, it focuses more within the tribe. So one of the things that the tribe is interested is how does climate change affect other sectors of the community? Because largely we've been working with the Natural Resources and Environmental Department. So they're interested in seeing how the senior citizens and the center that works with them is affected, how housing is the community building sustainably, is the community looking at other alternative means for energy, the youth, getting the youth involved, the fisheries department, which is totally separate from the environmental department. It's managed. So, how do they consider adaptation? So, looking at, talking to all those different groups and then bringing them together and understanding, what's the next steps. And really, if only one sector of the community is working on addressing climate change, it really won't be as effective as a community-wide effort of multiple stakeholders coming together and seeing where they're considering climate change in their work.
So mine's a little bit different because I do work with mining companies and then also with tribal communities. And so a big part of that is there is a difference in training with those two communities. But it's really important that each comes to the table respecting the knowledge base that the other brings, and also really having patient consideration. And us as academics also not being in this ivory tower. Really understanding the problems that each of these communities face and working towards solution-based problems. I think has been some of the more important parts of our collaboration. But I'll also say that in looking at how to integrate Indigenous perspectives of reclamation into this, you can approach an idea, but it's up to the community to decide if they want to engage in this idea or not. And if they don't, they need to respect that and walk away from it and be able to do that. And sometimes it's the process of planting a seed, and then in a couple of years, that seed will grow. But I think that in the past, it's been too much of us as academics know how to do things, and really, I feel like in some capacity of data mining from Native communities, which is why there's a lot of hesitancy to do some of these research collaborations. So now, really making sure that the tribal communities, in particular, are the ones who are driving these research questions, and ensuring how that data is going to be protected.
I'm just one program under the Untitled Nation, and there's several other programs. So, like he was saying, that for us, we're behind in climate change and learning some stuff that come up. So there's also have duplicates of different projects going on, and we try to get and be involved in different outside entities like PAG, different. Well, for myself, the Tuscarora National Park, and they have different programs. So it's kind of hard to, for my program, we'll do one project and then another program will do this, find funding, and it's duplicates of all kinds of stuff. So we're still learning, trying to find out all these other stuff we can be involved in within the nation. And sometimes one program, they won't say anything, and another program, we'll find out a few years later. So it just depends on, it's internally mainly that we need to get together, try to figure out who we can be part of on the outside to bring in within our nation.
I think there are lessons for all of us who are engaging stakeholders in these comments. What kind of local, regional, and national environmental policies are you promoting? Do you want me to repeat that?
I have mine, but I don't think it's you want to start?
So on a national level, I think, again with extraction, it's really looking at sustainable development goals. I see an important framework of that is using traditional ecological knowledge to mitigate and adapt to climate change. As I mentioned before, Indigenous people are already sustainable. before colonization happened. So we really need to acknowledge that traditional ecological knowledge and how it informs the interconnectedness of social, political, and environmental development. Nation states have really looked at this as separate entities, but these all interrelate together, and so that's really what we need to start addressing as a national policy. Regionally, states develop our approach, especially structuring towards extraction industry, without always taking into consideration how that might impact public health, infrastructure development, or environmental impacts. So really, I think it can be problematic when our primary development is looking at extraction industries. And then locally, I really believe looking at allowing people, especially tribal nations, the autonomy to revitalize our traditional ecological practices. Right now, due to state and federal policies, they really tend to regulate how individual tribes and what they can do on their territory. Some great examples of that would be, rotational grazing happening and not allowing people to move past geopolitical barriers. Another example of that would be the border wall and how that impacts our traditional movement across the border to see our families. So that's a way that we can create change on the local level. I also think that there needs to be respect towards the prior informed consent when we look at traditional ecological knowledge. Sometimes it can be misappropriated. An example of that can be the NRCS, using slash and burn practices, Lakota, but applying it to other communities in the Midwest, when that's not always appropriate. So really using the traditional ecological knowledge, but recognizing that it needs to be a regional knowledge base.
Yeah, I think what Lydia mentioned about tribes are autonomous and they're sovereign, so really giving them the authority to make those decisions with how they want the research to move forward. With the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, we have an actual formalized research agreement that's a legal contract that we're bound to. So it really defines the trajectory of the relationship and the research. So I think within the confines of our research, we try not to promote policies, we leave that up to the tribe. But I can speak as a graduate assistant with the Native Nations Climate Adaptation Program. A lot of our work in reaching out to Native Nations through the climate assessment has really focused on those national level efforts. Funding is a huge factor for Native Nations, and looking at those programs that are accessible to them, we try to advertise that on our website and through our monthly webinar call, and just making sure that those resources are connected. There's not a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of regional or local efforts, just because we try not to focus too heavily on one region, where our program focus covers 6 states of the Southwest. So really, it's up to the tribes in those regions to seek out those more local and regional efforts, but the national efforts are really important.
I think region among tribes, we've had this conversation now in the past few weeks and months. We recently got a telephone call with some California tribes. They're smaller, they describe themselves as a couple hundred acres, as far as, I guess as far as their breadth of location. But, they said, okay, why do we get involved? We're a 200-acre tribe. What are we going to have a climate adaptation program for? So we encourage them to reach out regionally to the tribes, other Paiute tribes that were there, and there's multiple. And the same thing could be talked about, recently I think it was the city of Tucson, Pima County, and we're going in the route of creating an adaptation plan. How was the reach out to Untitled Nation or Pasquaquie, same thing. And so it's something where when funding is getting cut, it's something that I've talked to the tribes about, is that partnerships are going to become key. I don't know if you can really go at this alone in the future. And one tribe doing their own adaptation plan, I don't know if that's going to happen. And so I think when you combine regionally and look at other tribes that are your neighboring tribes, and reach across the aisle and see if partnership is going to be there, I think it's going to be important. So we push that kind of, communication. Nationally, Skylar's mentioned, there's a number of things that are going on right now. BIA, as of I think 2 weeks ago, had a name change from their climate program. It's no longer BIA Tribal Climate Change. It's BIA Tribal Resilience. So that's a name change. And so it's, and a lot of the sites we had originally after the administration change, we promoted a lot of resources were scrubbed, although they're archived now, so a lot of the resources are still there. Funding is going to be a key thing for most of these tribes. And when we did our assessment, and most ones we talked to, most of the funding comes from EPA funding. BI over the last 2 years gave a lot of money. We're funding 2 tribes for training and adaptation work, but most of, I think majority really came from EPA before this. And right now, I mean, we'll see what happens in the next budget, but there's, talks of, 30% cuts to EPA and DOI. So I think it'll be important the next 2 months, I guess, the advocacy behind this and coming together as a community and seeing what actually could be funding going forward.
Oh, Marsee, I know as being part of the Working for the Nation, like you mentioned, just different funding comes along and we try to start up a program or start up a new policy for something, but it's just budgets get cut, so that's probably like the end of that program, and then it just gets pushed back and it's sitting there for a while until some more funding comes in. BIS is one of them. We get a lot of funding for different resilience. As part for my program, we have the part of the resilience, the buffalo grass. We were trying to promote that within the nation. It's an invasive species, and boy, this again is the funding that changes everything here and there. As far as I know.
I know you've spoken to this a bit, but if you could go a little more deeply, since you only have 4 minutes to start with. What kind of efforts, partnerships, and affiliations are you working on to create the policy changes you're trying to create?
So efforts are partnerships. I think, predominantly within our, neck of the woods with the University of Arizona, we work quite a bit with the Southwest Climate Science Centers. South Central Climate Science Center has a huge Native American component. They're located in Oklahoma. The landscape conservation cooperatives were huge funders for a lot of the tribal adaptation work that was going on the last couple of years. The climate hubs are there. I didn't mention this before, but really, amongst when I first started here, I was trying to figure out what the universities actually had a tribal climate change coordinator. And so as far as I know, it's only us at University of Arizona, Northern Arizona University, University of Oregon, and University of Oklahoma that have actually a named tribal person in that role. And so I think a lot of this, as far as these efforts to come together and partner and work together to create these policy changes, it's those entities that we're really working with at the federal level and state levels. I think it's, and I joined the LCC board, or national board this last year, and they're one of the ones that are right now actually without a director at the national level. And so they don't really have the advocate other than a board. So I think, I think it's really working with one-to-one. So for example, the partnership with BI. Over the last 2 years of the Obama administration was huge for tribes. I think it was in the neighborhood of $19.5 million went into climate change work for tribes in the last 2 years of Obama. Under that, it's something that, so for example, for our policy change and working together, something we reached out to, and because a lot of us were reviewers as far as the grant applications that came in for tribes nationwide. Of course, we didn't review anything in the Southwest. I reviewed Midwest and Northeast and stuff like that. It was very evident to me when I first started reviewing all this stuff. It was, you had tribal applications that came in were 200 pages long for a grant application. And then some came in were 5 pages long. And so one of the questions I asked BA was like, I can tell which tribes have 10 grant writers working on it, and some tribes have 1 or don't have any that have an environmental department. So what is the mechanism behind that to really look at the need? So what tribe really needs this money to move climate change forward? And they have a problem right now with it. There really isn't a scoring mechanism there at the federal level, at least I was told. And so it's something where you're just looking at face value of the application and saying who has a better application and going to award those dollars. So I think if you see those problems, I think it's identifying those, working among your partnerships, and not being afraid to bring up these issues with federal partners and state partners when you see something that's a huge problem for tribes. And tribes shouldn't be really negatively impacted because they don't have the money to hire 10 grant writers. That shouldn't happen. And so it's something that, and you don't know that unless you're really opening up the communication lines at the ground level and be able to go out and for a federal agency contact that tribe and talk about need. So that's a big thing I think moving forward. So.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think it's really important as tribes move forward in this work that, you know, begin to be thinking creatively about, you know, working, you know, those words, climate change, out of the picture, you know, and focusing on, you know, resiliency, sustainability, security, and really coming at this thinking of, you know, creative alternatives that, you know, in the past, tribes have been able to depend, at least for the past 8 years, on, you know, their regular sources of funding from EPA, GAP, General Assistance Program, BAA sources of funding, thinking of other creative partnerships other than just working to get grants with the federal government, looking for those really creative collaborations with universities, with foundations, and looking for ways to, you know, avoid the controversy that, you know, is surrounded by climate change.
Lydia spoke in her presentation about a more global look at Indigenous and Native communities. So the fifth question is about how do Native communities that you work with mirror other marginalized people around the world, to your knowledge?
We just started collaboration less than a month ago with First Nations University of Saskatchewan. And then also I've had conversations with the Secretary of Education of Mexico recently, and we have a meeting actually next week. Both those countries are highly interested in looking at climate change work and environmental work within their Indigenous communities. And so I think, Scott mentioned other funding sources. It's something where other countries are looking at this and are funding this heavily. Trudeau out of Canada is putting a lot of money into this. And so it's something that they've had several conversations with us about some of the same stuff we deal with down here. You know, environmental education for their students. You know, they just started an environmental degree up there, working with First Nations in Canada as far as some of the mining stuff that we've been talking about, and how to get a seat at the table is their main issue in Canada right now. So some of the mining companies that come in and some of the consultation Leah mentioned is something they don't really have. And so it's bringing that in, I think. Other communities right now, we do have a mission within the Maori program for our funding to work with Mexico. It's something that we originally started. The first year I was here, we worked quite a bit through the consulate here in Tucson and trying to bring together, I guess, both our communities from Mexico and Arizona. And we had several meetings the first year, and it kind of died off, to be honest. And so it's something we're trying to rebuild now and moving forward, I think. And so it's really, like I said, it's networking, collaboration. And so once you find that partner down there, in this case in Mexico, I think it's going to take off. But right now we're really at the beginning stage for us, at least.
As I mentioned, mining does happen globally, and we see the same patterns that were happening in the Native communities here happening internationally. Peru, Ghana, Mexico, being a lot of them. I think what it comes down to is it's really common in poor communities, not whether that be white poor communities or people of color poor communities. And it comes down to this privilege and power dynamic that happens in poor communities being more or less resource extraction colonies. And so just like we can see what's happening here, we see the community infighting, increased violence, loss of land, loss of traditions happening, water contamination, and health problems increasing in these communities internationally as well as locally. So if we can improve these strategies that are happening here, where we actually have a lot of, relatively speaking, good enforcement in these environmental policies on social justice policies, how that can translate to other countries. And actually my research group does do a series of collaborations with Brazil, Mexico, and I believe Canada, British Columbia. So we are in that process of doing these collaborations to translate the findings that we're finding here to other nations. There's also a series of another graduate student at the University of Arizona who's working on more or less creating step-by-step guides for Indigenous nations internationally and how to navigate this resource extraction process. So I think that there's a lot of really good work that's being done that can apply the findings that we're finding here in Indigenous communities to other Indigenous communities internationally.
Working with different tribes, other tribes in Arizona and Mexico, and a few other states, but we do see the same climate change effects on like migration and vegetation, but it's different effects, but it's still the same kind of effects from climate change. The water and also how it affects the animals and plants, all that. But we just, it's kind of the same thing, so we work together and try to find funding and also all of that, and see if we can also work with different policies that will fit with all of us, all the tribes within the U.S.
Speaking of policies, what are some practical, actionable steps that you've used with your communities that have moved your climate change projects forward?
Sure, yeah. So I think really practical is understanding where the community sits on these issues. So one of the efforts that we did was we just held it was a very basic workshop with community members to allow them to identify what are the key issues. We didn't want to focus this research on what we thought were from the literature review and allowing them to identify. So what came up, what rose to the surface was cultural resources, water quantity, and water quality. And that was something that we just hadn't have been able to grasp, because we would have assumed that the water is the key issue. But it was the cultural resources that really rose to the surface. And I think starting with an approach that allows the community to identify the scope of the research, having the community members and tribal government really direct the scope and the trajectory of where the project is going is really key, so that the work that comes out of it is going to be useful to them.
I think one of the things that when we talk to tribes, I think one of the bigger things, we always talk to like the environmental manager, water manager, or air quality person. That's usually who we get first, and can go from there. I think Swinomish out of Washington State, I think when they came down as one of the 11, I think only ones that we can identify as, they actually had a proclamation from the tribal council about their work with climate change and their commitment to it. So having that buy-in from a government body, I think, before moving forward, was something we didn't really see nationally. And so when we talk to tribes now moving forward, I think the importance of getting your government body behind it and getting that buy-in from the council, I think really goes farther, and it will take that project much more, further down the road. So often, tribal councils change over depending on how they're structured. So you may have a new council come in, doesn't want anything to do with it, and it's going to go away. The same thing we've seen several times. I mentioned about half of them have shelved it. Well, a lot of reasons why half of them have shelved the project was, somebody wrote a grant, an environmental manager, and that person got another job, and it went away. But they didn't really have that government buy-in. So I think getting that buy-in from your elected people is probably one of the most important things, I think, when we start off these projects with tribes.
And I'll just add in, I think it's really important to build a capacity in our communities towards moving forward on these grants and starting to propose these own grants in our own community and self-funding them, I think is also going to be an important actionable step in the future, so that we don't have to be dependent on federal funding.
Okay. Can you describe a successful initiative that you worked on that could be used elsewhere? And by the way, there's water down here. You want to pass it down? I noticed your glasses were empty. Sorry for the plastic.
Want to start this one?
Again, my program is the Wildlife and Vegetation Program. we participated, but it's a program, but it's already started within Pima County already, but it's the buffalo grass. And they have, used to have all these events, it's online also, and it's a buffalo grass day. And everyone participates and they have, it's like activity, and it's a one-day event, but it worked for us on the nation, so it's a one-day event, and a lot of people will come out, the teachings and all that. But that was one initiative that we pushed forward because have it almost every year, and also, even though we don't have funding for it, it's been reminded every year how it affects the vegetation and wildlife. Because every year there's like this around this time, there's lightning strikes and fire and all that, and how it just spreads quickly. So that's one project that it kind of burned into the mind for our people, and that was one of the projects.
So I think I mentioned a number of different things NCAP has done over the last couple of years. One new thing, which I think is going to be successful, so hopefully I can talk about this one, is that it's called the LEO Network. So it's a Local Environmental Observers Network, based and started out of Alaska, funded by EPA. It was something that basically the whole concept drives citizen scientists. And so they actually created an app, and people can go out in the field, and if they see some kind of change in the field environmentally, they'll take a picture with their phone, upload it to the app, describe the change they're seeing, and then it gets actually sent to the University of Alaska, and their researchers there will verify it and they'll upload it to the database. So a lot of that is basically getting people to talk about climate change. But it's something that is a tough task to do sometimes, and because you're actually seeing it from somebody in the field, somebody you can relate to. And so we're actually a partner with them. They started their Northwest Hub at the Northwest Indian College, is the first hub in the lower 48. And so they're based out of Washington County, handling the Northwest. We've asked now to be the Southwest hub. And so we're hopefully going to take that same network down here and into our region and be really the verifiers behind the app and verifying information that comes into us. So I think that initiative, alone will get people talking more so about a lot of the stuff as adapting technology, which is hopefully bringing another youthful group and talking about this. But I think it's something that, like I mentioned before, there's a ton of programs out there. It's just figuring out what you think is actually working, behind it, seeing the data behind it, seeing the statistics, and really drawing in some successful stuff that's happening anywhere else in the world right now. And so it's been going well for the last 3-4 years in Alaska, and hopefully we can take it down here in the Southwest.
I can comment on one effort that wasn't actually related to my research. In 2013, my community, the Tuscarora Nation, we celebrated 300 years of survival. In 1713, the English, along with a bunch of enemy tribes, came in and they basically forced us out of North Carolina, our original homelands. And so the Tuscarora Nation had to migrate over a period of 90 years in different waves, different families, up to New York, where they eventually found shelter among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So in 2013, what the Tuscarora Nation wanted to do was to commemorate that through a hike, running, canoeing, biking, a group of young adults, all the way the 1,200-mile journey from the date that the end of the war to however long it was going to take us to get up to New York. And so I was working at the time at the university here, and so I actually had to take time off so I could be a part of that journey. I didn't join for the full, it took them from March to June, but I took a week and I hiked alongside them. And I think an important part of that was, it wasn't just to celebrate, our survival, but the effort was to bring attention to the shift of species that are migrating. Namely for us is the sugar maple. As it gets hotter, trees are moving. They're moving. They're going to go where it's going to be more adaptable. And that effort was to bring attention to the fact that people moved in the past. When things got bad, they moved. So the Tuscarora Nation really wanted to bring attention to that effort and the need for more action on human-powered solutions to climate change.
So one of the initiatives that I've been really involved in, and I think is really important, is community outreach and education, especially to Native youth. My research group does an activity where we actually talk about mining, but doing mining on a muffin. And so students will mine blueberries or walnuts. And a part of the process is, it's fun to mine those and understanding how much it costs for the cost and production of it, but also the reclamation process of it. And so these are not programs that were in place when I was a kid. Like, definitely, you see at an early age, students are starting to have this conception of land and understanding the give and take of these processes. So I think that one of the strongest initiatives that we have in Indian country is the education of our youth and having strength in both Western knowledge, but also in our traditional knowledge. And I think the generation before me really started to clear that path of what's possible. And I think our generation is really pushing those barriers, and the next generation is, it's really exciting to see what's going to happen to them because they have the strength of not knowing really the same barriers that I knew, and also being really strengthened in cultural knowledge. So I think that's some of our greatest initiatives is education, both traditional and Western.
It's fascinating, Skylar, that you brought up movement or migration to adapt. And I think most of us think of bugs and birds and animals moving, but we don't think of trees moving, right? We don't think that, these kinds of sentient life actually also move. So thank you for that. So if you have one big takeaway that you'd like the audience to walk away with, or step or action that we should take, or knowledge that we should have, maybe a question we didn't ask, what would that be?
Sure, I'll start. I just think that it's important to recognize that, the title of this panel, How Tribes Are Learning to Adapt. Tribes have adapted, all people have adapted. And so it's really not about, that the university has to come in and teach, indigenous people how to adapt. The people are in the places that they are because they've been there for centuries, if not millennia, learning to adjust and adapt. And I think that's important to recognize that our indigenous people are resilient and highly adaptive.
So I think I mentioned before, so one of the big things I always try to push is that throughout my entire talk is communication, collaboration, the networking side of it. We have a website, which we took a year to build, ncap.arizona.edu. We have several social media stuff that's out there, so if you have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, we don't have Snapchat. Like that stuff, and after this thing, if you have business cards, share those business cards with us. It's something that, honestly, I actually gave the same speech in Canada, I think, at the last time. And Dr. Carla Chief, who is a prominent professor on campus, I usually give conference talks with her. And we've talked about this before. Every time we go to a conference, everyone and give the same tribal climate change talk, 99% of the people in the room are Native American. And so it's getting Western science into the same room. And it's empowering to me to get this invite to come up here, because this is where we want to give this talk. This is where we want to communicate with Western science, and traditional economic knowledge. But it's unfortunate that when we go to these major talks around the country, a lot of them are just attended by Native American communities. And so I think we need to get the Western science involved more so with the EK. So.
Anyone else to answer that question? What takeaways do you want to say?
A couple of them. It's just educate yourself, just being more involved, just know your surroundings. That's pretty much it.
But there's multiple ways of knowing, and Western science has a knowledge base, traditional ecological knowledge has a knowledge base, and now a lot of Western science is starting to realize that traditional ecological knowledge makes sense. And I took an ecology course this last semester, and they're talking about ecology starting in 1934 by Arthur Tansley. And it's like, no, we've been doing that for a long time. So again, come into both of these conversations with respect and understanding of the knowledge base that each of you bring to that conversation when wanting to conduct collaborations, and making sure that you amplify those Native voices. Because again, in the work that I did with extraction companies, it's so easy for them to ignore that, and a lot of times it does happen, unless they're leasing land from tribal nations, but tribal nations need to be at that seat, have a seat at that table as well.
You guys are going to now have to share
One microphone, oh my God. Because we're going to take questions from the audience. Yes.
We'll just pass the microphone to the next person after their answer.
So one thing that I find really interesting within sort of the world of environmental activism is this rhetoric that we need to mitigate some sort of inherent human destructiveness and that we're naturally bad for the environment. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on maybe the attitude that humans can in fact be healthy for the ecosystem and beneficial, and if you see that in your work at all and how that might factor in.
I think in some of the research that I've seen, especially on focusing on resilience, it's looking at social ecological systems, and that, you know, it's the water and it's the animals and it's the plants. And people are always, you know, off in their cities or their homes. But people are a part of those systems. People are a part of the, you know, a part of the environment. There's no, especially for Indigenous people, there's no divide where, oh, I'm in society and then I'm in nature. And I think that's, you know, a really important thing to recognize, that for Indigenous people, that divide isn't there. And so, you know, moving that work forward in, you know, in a Native context could be really beneficial, and that Western science could have a lot to learn about resilience.
Anyone else want to answer that question?
Well, I think we're also talking about a very different caring capacity. You know, when a lot of our nations, you know, in prior times didn't have this huge population that we're amassing. We aren't having our water cycles change the same way that they're being changed now. So yes, we're being resilient, but we also have to count like the vast amount of pressures that our environments are also undergoing right now.
Somebody from this side of the room, question.
I was just wondering if this is a pretty general question, so I guess people can only speak to what they've seen. But is there actual sovereignty in tribal nations? Is there a general feeling of this is actually a nation whose laws are respected?
They both, as of today, yesterday, my uncle's chairman and my other uncle's vice chairman. So I think, as far as the political side of the family, is that it's we are sovereign nations, and it's something that we do control our own laws and policies within our own reservation. My reservation is about 1.4 million square acres. We have about 9,000 member tribe in Washington State, and so I think a lot of stuff. And I'm also on the side of this. I'm also private business development, and so I have multiple businesses within the tribe. And so it's something that, as far as, and I've worked with them for the last couple of years on these things. So it is, like I said, at least with my tribe, at least our attitude, we control our own sovereignty. Of course, that's, you know, early 90s, I can remember those things being under attack, at least for my tribe, but it is something that we consider that.
Sorry, I was just wondering, is that respected by the United States? And if not, what?
It's a really big question, yeah. I think within my community, our relationships with the United States actually predates the United States. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy goes back to, you know, first contact with the Dutch and with the British and with the French and then the Americans. So the United States Constitution says treaties are the supreme law of the land. So those treaties that, the United States signed with Native nations, they're not really taken with the same respect that we have for them. So I think that's a big area there that needs to be addressed and recognized by, our current policy and lawmakers, is that, those treaties were the first treaties here. They're just as legitimate as the treaties with France or Britain or China or Japan. And those have real consequences for us when we want to, go back and forth across North America. The borders are arbitrary. We have rights through the Jay Treaty to go from the US to Canada, and I have families on both sides of that arbitrary line. So educating, everyone at every step of that process is important.
Somebody from the side next.
So I wanted to give all of you thank you for being here and sharing with us. And I have a question for Lydia. What inspired you to do this type of work? And the other question would be, what message would you give young girls to continue doing this type of work?
So I did my undergrad in California at UC Santa Cruz. And I was really into doing marine science and being outdoors. I'm an avid trail runner. But as I was going through this process and getting ready to apply for graduate schools, I had this thought of, again, thinking of my community and thinking of my grandparents, what they taught me, and what my parents taught me. And marine biology is great, but that's not helping my community. And so it really came down to I actually took off 3 years and worked for UC Davis as an environmental toxicologist and working on soil samples and impaired river systems, and just seeing how in a lot of these impaired river systems, they are near communities of color. They're near people who are often ignored because they don't have power or money. And seeing the same relations, seeing these beautiful brown kids and running around ag fields and thinking of my nieces and my nephews, it really hammered home that it's great to be in marine science, but that's really selfish, and that I have a bigger purpose in that of helping address the issues that are impacting Native communities. And so I kind of went home and looked around and what is impacting our community, what's impacting Indian country, and extraction time and time again is something that impacts our community. And it's not quite as fun, I think, in some capacity as the sea turtles, but it's really rewarding. I mean, I will say that in the context of going out and field sampling in 100-degree temperature and digging holes is rough. But I really enjoy what I'm learning, and again, understanding how the ripple effects that it has on our community is so much more important. And at the end of the day, when I maybe am having a selfish moment of I don't want to do this, my quantitative PCR isn't working and I feel really frustrated, then there's this memory that it's not just about me and the way that I'm feeling at this moment, but it's about raising awareness and finding solutions for my community and for Indigenous communities in general. And as far as women in science, there are a lot of amazing role models right now that are out there, especially Indigenous role models. It's amazing, Native women are killing it. You guys are as well. But I was saying, it's amazing what's out there. And Chad mentioned Cooperative Chief. She's a mother. She's a professor, and she's culturally competent. That is the kind of woman that I want to be. And so I see these people who are before me who are incredibly inspiring. And again, that's what motivates you, is that these people who are so incredibly selfless, not only in who they are as an individual, but in the kind of research that they do. So I hope that answers the question.
Hi, and thank you, and it's wonderful to see this ongoing grassroots, because I think that's what a solution is. That's an old-fashioned word, I suppose. I was just recently privileged to attend gatherings, conferences, and so on within the halls of the United Nations. And I just wondered, it's very wonderful, the Sustainable Development Goals, that really give a world vision. All countries signed on to it except for 2. The U.S. was one of them. But, and the Paris Treaty, as you know, falls under one of those 17 goals. But a vision was presented for the world, kind of a unified approach to development. And I just wondered, and I would certainly encourage you, if you did participate, there is We the People, is what it's called, wethepeople.org, where people are starting to network internationally, because as was being lauded within those halls, not only do we manage to get to vision that included water, it's all those goals. It has to do with water, human rights, education, poverty, air quality, da-da-da-da-da-da, and then how to really make that, how to ground that is very exciting, because now we have technology. We don't have to rely on ambassadors or representatives. And there is a great excitement at the possibility of outreach and this emerging worldwide network. And I just wondered if, and if not, please check it out, to just participate on such a global endeavor.
So where we're housed at is we're actually housed at the Institute of the Environment. So we're basically a conglomerate of multiple programs that are one institute. So we're one program. A lot of our faculty actually went to Paris, and we're part of that. And it's something that their research has been, they've been in the business for 30, 40 years. And so we have some prominent faculty that were part of it. I think the 2 groups that NCAP at least belonged to one was Rising Voices, which is an Indigenous Climate Change Movement, grassroots. And the other one is Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group. So those are 2 main groups that we're really involved with nationally. Both of them sent our statements to Paris, and when they're part of that Indigenous movement. So I think it's what you just said, the grassroots movement thing. I think it's something that we've heavily tried to get involved with in the United States, especially those 2 groups, and hopefully trying to be involved at the national or global level. But I think UVA's kind of done a great job. Since we're only in our infancy stage of 2 years, we'll hopefully get there soon down the road. So. Yep.
First off, I want to say I appreciated that slide showing differences in land management approaches and the gaps that need to be bridged. The ecology of Hawaii seems to have changed greatly when the approach to land custodial division was redefined. Their native division was based on a balance where each group owned a piece of the mountain down to the ocean and was able to have that uniform balanced ecology where they benefited from all types of resources. Is that kind of change in custodial approach something that native tribes had to deal with? Are they being allowed to, if it caused problems, what were they, and if were they allowed to, are we being allowed to, at this point in time, bridge that gap?
So I know of, in Alaska in particular, there is a couple of cases where the National Park Service gave a period of time of allowing of having Indigenous people in Alaska manage a lot of their sites, and actually seeing a huge, I think it was like a 40% increase in the amount of abundance of in-species diversity that was happening in those regions. And so now they're slowly transitioning to having Indigenous people manage those lands. And I think that's a model that we want to emulate here, right, is having Indigenous people manage our lands and also manage national lands, because we have been co-evolving with these ecosystems for a long time. We know the intricacies of these lands. And so I think that can also be really applied in a lot of agricultural practices as well, when we look at traditional agricultural practices as opposed to modifying Western agricultural practices. Someone else want to address this?
As I say, land management, but on wildlife management, at least from my tribe, over the last 5 years, we've planted pronghorn and then we went the route of wolves and then grizzly this year. And of course, with everything in the news about Yellowstone right now, it's, Cal Ranchers are up in arms about this, but at least from the Colorado Confederate Tribes point of view, they've heavily been involved in wildlife management and bringing back some of the native species that we once had 100 years ago. And so it's something that I think is important for us, and it's something I think within a 3-year period of time, now we have 8 separate wolf packs in north central Washington. And so it's something that, I don't know if you've ever seen a wolf, but it's the first time I've ever seen one. And they're probably as heavy as I am and as big as I am. So it's something that, for me personally to see, it's something that, I think value in that, and I'm glad that the tribe made that decision. But it is some, I guess, consequences to that with cattle management too.
Thank you very much for your collective experience and sharing it with us this afternoon. I have a question for you regarding other countries. In your view, have you seen other countries have stronger and more engaged and positive relationships with their indigenous communities that could serve as models or ways forward for us to be thinking about?
I think it largely depends on who's in power at the time. I mean, I think you look at Canada, and the previous government before Trudeau was very conservative, and there was basically, from what I understand, that relationship and understanding with Indigenous peoples was not there. And you have a complete shift over to the Trudeau government, which is doing, making tremendous effort at working on reconciliation and reconciling that, legacy of colonization. And I think that can kind of be problematic for Indigenous people, having that huge pendulum shift from, one way to the other. But I think that's the reason why, at least as I understand it, that we are so resilient is because we have been able to, deal with, the changes in government, very conservative to very liberal. And I guess just one example that I always hear, is that the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, for a lot of communities wasn't that bad, because they were prepared to, be able to do well with very little. And so in that time period, I guess that's, that was a number of environmental as well as political and social shifts in society. So just being able to weather those storms when they come up is, I guess, a good example of how when those political shifts come and go, Indigenous people are able to cope with them.
Just want to add on. So I think it's also really exciting right now in Mexico. For the first time, there's going to be an Indigenous woman who's traditionally trained as a medicine woman running as a presidential candidate for the movement. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting progressions that are happening. And also if you look at the Maori in New Zealand and the different relationship that they have with their government based on their treaties. So there are also different types of considerations that you have to take into account with different nations and how they traditionally interacted with Indigenous people there.
And that pendulum swing scholars, I just had the conversation with Lydia last night about this, that we were preparing for this thing, is getting more Native Americans elected to office. I think it's another one of the things where I've continually pushed as far as no matter what degree or program you're going into, to have a seat at the table, we really need to have elected officials. And there really isn't that many Native American congressmen out there, or I don't think there's any senators anymore. I think that Nighthorse Campbell was the last one. So it's something that, as far as policy goes, I think we have to be thinking about that as Native American tribes and be pushing that forward, I think.
So my question is a little along the lines of the sovereignty question a little bit earlier. And since water and air and wildlife and even soil doesn't recognize borders between nations, how is sustainability, climate change showing up in tribal consultations with the federal government, whether that be EPA or Interior? And are organizations like yours that are doing this research and collecting this information able to drive some of that narrative in those tribal conversations, or I'm sorry, consultations?
It's the consultation question. I recently attended, it was actually last year, I think, at the National Congress of American Indians conference in Phoenix, actually. And it was right around the time of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and I think Army Corps was there, and Army Corps had this scheduled 2-hour listening session on consultation. Well, I think the listening session ended about, how long? 6-7 hours, I think, went into the night, talking about consultation. I think it's something that, are we still live, I guess, talking about this stuff? So, I think, I've been a big proponent, and I guess speaking out about this quite a bit, is that consultation has been on the books for a long time. And this isn't a new concept. And if consultation wanted to happen, it's there. And so it's one of those decisions, I think, as a federal government would make, or they make, do they want to involve the tribe or not? And so it's not a new thing. And so I think it's taking that responsibility, as I said, to go out and reach across the aisle, bring in tribes out at the table, and not wait till the end. And I think it's something that, moving forward, has to happen. I think at least the previous administration, I think, we moved that conversation. I don't know where that conversation is going to go now. I think we have, a lot of us have kind of questions that are going to come down the road. But as far as our end, as far as the university goes, at least within our own program, at least the program I run, we've left it up really to tribe. And so whatever research or data they need, we'll try to assist them as much as possible to go to the federal government and work with the federal government on different, funding that's out there or not. And so it's something that we have not pushed. I've been really cognizant about that, is that I'm not going to go out to any tribe and say you need to have this data or this data. It's whatever they're requesting. I think that's the way this communication should happen, is from a tribal perspective, reaching out and saying this is what we really need. Not us going out and saying, hey, and driving data down the throat. So at least that's what we're trying to do right now.
Thank you very much for the complicated, complex ways that you presented the issues, and especially also thank the acknowledgement of specific impacts on women, because I think in many of these conversations that's not included in any meaningful way. So I have one question and one comment. All right. So one question is, how should ideas about development and security, those are seem like recurring themes that came up in your presentations, how should we be thinking about those? Right? What does development actually mean, particularly in indigenous communities, but in globally, right? Because the conventional model of development has led us to where we are now. Same with security, right? Just thinking about security in militarized terms, which is the dominant paradigm, right? So how should we, all of us here, and as well as people in indigenous communities, think about development and security? And then the third question is more of like a rhetorical question, but I'm wondering what should be the nature of the relationships between colonized peoples, formerly enslaved people, to the state? What's the relationship between those communities and the state, especially when the state are some of the biggest purveyors of violence?
I thank you for your comments, and I really appreciate, especially on the idea of development. I struggle with that a lot, especially looking at, what is sustainability, the whole concept of developed versus developing nations, what are we developing towards, I think is a question to address before, even pressuring, so-called underdeveloped or developing nations or indigenous peoples to develop. I think indigenous models of what does it mean to be a human and your place, I think are important questions to address, to answer that. I think, at least for my community, it all begins with three main concepts. It's peace, strength, and the power of a good mind. And those are all, traditional concepts that define who we are as people and how we move forward as a community. And so, answering those questions and how those are addressed, I guess, I think helps define, what you want as a community. And what I think is going to be most important is that we're feeding ourselves and we have water to drink. And those are the basic necessities. And I see it more and more indigenous communities are turning back to their traditional foods, because we found out that, the food from the colonizer just isn't cutting it, and so I think that's paramount, the food and the water and those things, peace, power, and the strength of good mind.
I'll say when thinking about economic development, I think that there's been, especially in a lot of indigenous communities, this narrative that like extraction industries are what the options are for us. Extraction industries and casinos, and we really need to get away from that narrative. If a tribe decides to engage in those types of technologies and development, then there needs to be a very thorough planning process. And for mining, the way I look at it is there needs to be a plan of what's going to happen to the land and how it's going to be used by the community before they start digging. There needs to be a contingency plan of how water is going to be cleaned, who's going to pay for it, and if that company goes bankrupt, how it's going to be paid for then, because all the scenarios have happened in our communities and continue to plague us. And we're, really getting the repercussions, not those who are doing this process. Now, I will say that it's been interesting working with mining companies, and I do think that there are people who really genuinely care about doing a good job and understand that that's an important part of the legacy and continuance of their industry. But you also are dealing with individual environmental engineers and land managers versus this corporate structure. And so it really takes for me, it makes me think a lot about this corporate social responsibility. Is that a real thing? Because at the end of the day, there is a certain amount of tension of community health and community desires versus this corporate structure. And I don't have an answer to that yet. But I think that those are the kind of considerations that we as Native Nations need to think about and have the capacity to really mitigate before we start to engage in these types of development plans. And that is why education and building capacity, getting training in all of these different sectors is so important.
I don't think we answered your security one. So I'll try to attach to the security one. My educational background, so I've been in mostly law. My educational background has all been in national security and terrorism policy. And so, but I've ended up working in environment. So I was actually first Native American graduate of the University of Maryland START program, so it's a terrorism center. I'm actually attending Georgetown this fall in an online program for applied intelligence. But a lot of the stuff I've kind of shifted toward has been more of climate change and terrorism. And so there's a professor on the University of Arizona campus I'm working with right now is a lot of the climate change that's happening in the Middle East, the migration movements among people, is not so much terrorist attacks, they're violent attacks because of clash of populations, because of climate change that's happening in the Middle East. So loss of natural resources, development that way, so you see people moving all around. And so they're labeled as terrorist attacks, but really looking down, breaking down the data, it's really just violent clashes among different populations or groups because of the migration issues that are happening. And so I think it's a brand new topic. I think Bernie Sanders, when he brought it up, it's climate change and terrorism, the concept. It is out there, starting to be, DOD is plugging a bunch of money into it. I think it's sometimes ignored is that the military is putting a bunch of money into this work. And so it's something that I think they're paying attention to it. I think most people should start paying attention to it because it's something that's going to be very important in the years to come.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much. I'm Isabel. I come from New Zealand. I live in Australia. And I'm working on Pacific Island health issues. And I'm very curious to hear your views about how we might help some of the islands. Let me give some more context. We know 32 villages in Fiji will have to move. So that's 32 out of 120. We have the whole of Tuvalu as a nation will have to move. And Tuvalu people have actually mentioned that they want to move their nation under their perspective. They don't want to have Pakeha, such as myself, or whitefella, as I will be called in Australia, come in and tell them how to move. I know by talking with my Samoan friends that a lot of New Zealanders and Pacific Islanders are helping Australian Aboriginal people deal with mining issues. And so we have the Mabo land rights that came through in Australia. But I was just wondering, and I know you have an enormous amount of work to do here at home, what could possibly happen in the future about Indigenous sharing and also working together to help nations move as they have to relocate into the future due to rising water. And thank you. My original degree is in earth science. I love chatting about the soil, so thank you.
I think a really great example is the village of Newtok in Alaska that is, has to move. And they actually have to, they have a plan that's been in the works since, I believe, the 80s, a relocation plan. So it's not an adaptation or mitigation, it's relocation. And I think their approach, you can see their approach to their village of Murtarvik, that a community they're establishing. Really, a part of that is, what do we want our community to look like? Not just like where we're going to put the houses and the roads, but how are we going to be as people? These efforts to really reconcile a lot of our past, I guess, inner turmoil and stuff like that, I think is a really important aspect of what they do. So that's the village of Newtok in Alaska.
And do you think elders would be available to actually move and share that knowledge of how they develop that plan? So it's Indigenous talking to Indigenous?
I'm not sure to what extent within that community that they could share that, but I do know that the plan that I've seen, their relocation plan, is, I think, a really good example of what other communities can use, because it does have that focus on consulting all the community members and creating a shared vision of what relocating looks like.
So Newtok actually has, just to give you a name, Fred Eckelhock is their relocation coordinator. And so he's been working with the state for quite a while on that plan. And so he travels quite a bit nationally. And so he does a lot of these talks, same as we do, and talk about relocation efforts that are happening there.
For our tribe, originally before the Gaddis purchase, the lands crossed into Mexico, we still have communities in Mexico. So right now we're having a hard time because right now the Mexican government let people there have ownership of these lands, and so they have communities within these lands that are becoming farmland on the other side of the bottom. So right now, the Untitled Nation is trying to negotiate with the Mexican government. So it's just it's a hard time trying to figure out how we're going to do this. Just the multiple. One was trying to purchase the land. One, I'm not sure the other one's negotiate with giving them another portion, but it's just that's part. Right now they're still trying to figure that out. So right now the communities on that side are having a hard time because they're still sitting in somebody else's that took over their land, and they're taking over the wells and stuff like that, and the water. So that's an issue we're having with our people on the other side.
Hi, on behalf of the Osage and Cherokee Nations, I thank all of you for being here. I just have a question about have you worked with any traditional adversarial, the historical adversarial relationships? How would you suggest getting nations that sit maybe next to each other, or they're stuck next to each other, that don't want to be next to each other? How would you be getting them to work together? And also, have you worked with any of the nations up in the Southwest, such as the Grand Ronde or the Salish, or not the Salish, but the Unclaw?
So my other graduate student, Lynn Ray, is actually doing some of her work with Salish Kootenai and Swinomish. And so she's doing her master project on that in the Pacific Northwest. Of course, I come from the Pacific Northwest, and so I have a lot of contacts up there still with the AT&I as their tribal group up there. As far as the getting people to come together that way, I don't know if I want to answer. I think it's, at least me personally, I think, I mentioned I sat as president of alumni for U of A for 10 years. I think it's something that I always make fun of the fact that I think the only way I lasted that long in a role was I wasn't from the state of Arizona. I had no stake in the game. I wasn't Navajo, Passamaquoddy, don't know what them. And as I communicate and work together across boundaries, because ultimately I think everybody understood my goal was education, graduation, and getting people jobs, and getting our students employed. And so I think it's something that, at least my selling point wasn't. I'm only advocating for this tribe or this tribe. And so I think it might be an outside person coming in and bridging those gaps. I don't know. But I think that's something that's worked for me at least here.